Hello, everyone. Welcome to Brainwaves. I'm Brandon Staglin, your host, and I'm Communications Director for IMRO, and also a new board member of IMRO. I'm proud to say. Forget about that for now. And I also am a schizophrenia survivor. I'm also proud to say. And today we're going to talk about schizophrenia with a amazingly unconventional researcher, very brilliant guy named Phil Corlett, Dr. Phil Corlett, and he's here with us today. Phil, thank you for being with us. Talk about your research today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And thanks for coming back to Brainwaves. I guess I didn't scare you away the last time.
No, I had fun last time, and I'm looking forward to this time too.
Very good, very good. Thanks. So, Phil, I wanted to ask you first to introduce yourself a little bit in a nutshell, who you are and what you do. Can you do that, please?
Absolutely. So, my name's Phil Corlett. I'm an assistant professor of psychiatry at Yale, and I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, which means that I try and use data gathered from the human brain to learn things about how the human mind works. And I'm particularly interested in situations where perhaps mentally things aren't going as well as they could be, and specifically I'm interested in psychosis, which we define as a sort of disconnection between one's thoughts and what's really happening in the world, and between one's perceptions and what might be really happening in the world. And through generous support from IMRO, we've been able to explore some of those ideas towards not only understanding delusions and hallucinations, but perhaps treating them a little bit better. So I'm excited to kind of share that project with you guys today.
Excellent, and the work you've done so far has been pretty impressive. And oh, by the way, to the audience, if you have any questions, you can click on the little Q&A button on the Google Hangout and post questions for us as we go if you like. But I have a lot of questions for Phil too, so you can also watch if you like. And listen, so I'll jump right in with my questions. Phil, so in your research funded by IMRO with your Rising Star Award, you are hypothesizing that retigabine, which is a drug which has already been approved by the FDA for use in epilepsy, might be able to remedy a couple of symptoms of schizophrenia, specifically delusions and anhedonia, by opening potassium channels and specific neurons in the brain, and thereby kill two birds with one mechanistic stone, so to speak. And my question for you is, so if it can do these two things, could it possibly treat other symptoms of schizophrenia as well? And would there be symptoms of schizophrenia that might be worsened by it? And might there be other diseases that might be benefited by this kind of treatment?
That's a great question. So maybe I could take a step back and maybe walk you through how we came up with the idea, and then speak specifically to delusions, anhedonia, and also I think now hallucinations. We have some interesting new data in the lab about hallucinations that might fit those symptoms into this context too. So we got thinking about this idea basically when I started my PhD at the University of Cambridge, and we kind of worked on it and developed it, and I brought it over here to Yale to continue to work on it. And it kind of rests on the assumption of a sort of teleological approach to thinking about the brain, like thinking about why we have brains. And I think we have brains in order to make predictions about our world, to make predictions about what we think will happen next to us, in order that we can respond adaptively and we can respond quickly if things change. And really, in a nutshell, I think that schizophrenia and other psychotic illnesses might be a disruption, or might manifest as a disruption of that prediction mechanism, such that people start to make predictions about things that don't come true, and those predictions come to guide the way that they see the world and the way that they respond to it inappropriately. We think that that mechanism is even manifest at a single neuron level. So the data that I've gathered so far have been from functional imaging, where we take pictures of people's brains whilst they do different cognitive tasks. And we've been able to find a neural signature of making predictions and having one's predictions violated. And we've been able to measure that signature in people with psychosis, and we've shown that it's engaged when it really shouldn't be. With the IMRO funding, with the Rising Star Award, we've been able to start to test a potential treatment, a way of reversing that effect. And that treatment really rests on the idea that even single neurons, not just whole brain systems, but even single brain cells, might embody this idea of prediction. They might be trying to predict the inputs from other cells that they receive. And they might be doing that by shuttling different ion channels into and out of their membranes. And potassium is a key part of that process, potassium ion channels. And so if those channels are blocked, one might imagine that the cell's ability to make predictions isn't quite as good as it could be. And that might be what's happening in some patients with psychotic illness. And so if we can open those channels and help them work a little bit better, we might be able to restore the brain's ability to make predictions and respond adaptively. And I think, the work so far is really focused on delusions, and delusions is an example of inappropriate predictions. But I think it's not a huge step to conceive of anhedonia and negative symptoms in the same sort of way. So in that case, classically we describe anhedonia as an inability to feel pleasure in the things that we used to enjoy. And I think pleasure might not be the right way of thinking about negative symptoms. It's really about thinking about how good things might feel if we tried them. I always use the example of if someone's suffering from negative symptoms and you placed a chocolate cake in front of them, they would enjoy the chocolate cake and be able to eat it. However, if you ask them to come to think about producing their own cake, to make a list of the ingredients and to put together a recipe and to bake their own cake, that would be much more difficult for them to do. And I think that's really that really embodies this idea of how predictions might be really important for negative symptoms too. You need to be able to imagine into the future how good that cake is going to taste when you eventually produce it, and that's something that sadly patients with negative symptoms might not be able to do. And I think given that the systems in the brain that help us predict rewards are also involved in helping us predict the world and form beliefs, I think the two things might be quite intimately linked. And so that's why I think retigabine might help folks not only with delusions but also with negative symptoms. With hallucinations, I think we haven't focused on them so far. We're starting to in the lab now with a really brilliant psychiatry resident called Al Powers. We hit upon a phenomenon that was discovered at Yale many years ago called conditioned hallucinations. And this was in the sort of, I think the early 1900s in the psychology laboratory at Yale. People would be brought into the lab and they'd be told that they were going to have a hearing test. Every time a bulb lit up, they would hear a tone. And what the psychologist did, as we often do, is to change the contingencies of the task and to try and trick people. And so after seeing a pairing of the bulb illuminating and hearing the tone many, many times, they stopped playing the tone, and people continue to report hearing the tone for a long time, even when it's not played, as long as they see that initial bulb being illuminated.
Wow.
What we've done in the lab is really recreate that task. We found that people who hear voices are particularly susceptible to this effect, so they report hearing the tone for longer, even when it's not played. And we found some brain signatures of that process too. So when we show people stimuli on the screen and we don't play them a tone, the same sort of circuit that's engaged when we have people engaged in our causal learning task, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the striatum, and also a region of the brain called the insula, which is really important for predictions, is also engaged. And so we think that the same sorts of mechanisms, perhaps dealing with slightly different information now, dealing with perceptual predictions, might also be going awry in patients who hear voices and see things that aren't there.
So would these mechanisms be common mechanisms for delusions and anhedonia like you're going to treat with retigabine, or related or different mechanisms?
We think so, and we're actually going to pilot the task behaviorally in the subjects that we run from now on in our Rising Star Award study. We won't be able to place it into the scanner because there just isn't time. But I think we might be able to track whether or not retigabine helps people to not to see or not to report hearing the tone when we're actually not presenting it. To make people's perceptions of the task a little bit more veridical. So we'll be able to report back behaviorally at least, but we won't have any neural data.
Wow, that's amazing. I hope that works out, that will address those symptoms too. And that brings us up to our next question. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of recent buzz in the research-aware community that schizophrenia might not be just one illness, but a multitude of different illnesses. Certainly that it's certain that it arises from a variety of different causes and manifests in a variety of forms for different people. But I would like to believe that schizophrenia can be usefully viewed as one thing in terms of a common set of endophenotypes, which are like intermediate brain states from the original causes out through the symptoms that we see. And these intermediate brain states, if they're treated at the right place and time, might be able to, if the treatment might be able to remedy schizophrenia as a whole. I mean, I'm really hoping there could be such a treatment if we could just find the right targets for them. So what's your view on this? Do you think schizophrenia can be easily viewed as one illness, or whether it would be more easily viewed as a multitude of illnesses in terms of developing better treatments for it?
Well, I'm not so sure about a multitude of different illnesses. I think the approach we've tried to take in the lab is to rather than treat schizophrenia as a syndrome or a sort of constellation of symptoms that co-occur together, it's really been about trying to focus on particular symptoms. So the lab so far, as I said, has focused almost entirely on delusions. But now, like I said, we're trying to take what we've learned about delusions and apply it to some of the other problems that people with psychosis might suffer, so just to tackle hallucinations and to tackle negative symptoms, which I think are they're not as obvious up front, but I think they might be more debilitating, and helping negative symptoms is a real key aim, I think, of the field more generally, so that we can do things like perhaps help people get back to work, help people kind of function in society at a little bit of a higher level than they may be able to at the moment. And I think that's really important. With regards to thinking about schizophrenia as separate illnesses, there's no doubt that there are multiple different causal processes afoot. And I think your idea about endophenotypes that you mentioned is really important. I think that's really about trying to reduce the heterogeneity. One of the things that's really very frustrating about schizophrenia is that two patients with the same diagnosis of schizophrenia may not share any symptoms in common at all. There may be no overlap. And so that's something that's very difficult to study, in the laboratory at least. And so by taking it and breaking it down in a piecemeal manner, we think we can make a little tiny bit more progress. Obviously, it'll be interesting to try and put everything back together towards the end. And I think what I've said so far might give you a hint as to what I think might be the global thing that links everything together. But we're not there yet.
Okay, that's really interesting to hear about that perspective. In your Rising Star Award funded research, you're going to use a computational model to relate the behavioral changes that you see in your subjects due to retigabine administration with the changes in the neurons, underlying changes in the neurons that you hypothesize are taking place that underlie that change in behavior. And this thought kind of makes my hair stand on end, and that it's like showing that our minds come from matter. It's showing how the psychological process of learning can be modified by modifying something in the brain. And do you ever stop and think about the magnitude of shift in worldview that work like yours, the cognitive neuroscience like yours is helping to bring about in the world? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's very, very nice of you to say. I'm just really excited to be a part of this. The modeling idea, the equations at least have been around since the 1970s, or at least some of the computational processes that we think are really important have been around since the 1970s, perhaps even earlier, and they're kind of related to some of the early work on artificial intelligence that led to the development of modern computers. I think it's really exciting to be working at a time when we can gather really great data on how the brain is engaged when human subjects are doing these sorts of tasks. The nice thing about the modeling approach is that we can really look at the relationship between the processes in the models and people's brain responses in a way that we couldn't do with just their behavior alone. Much like I said, two patients can have no symptoms in common and still have schizophrenia, the same diagnosis. Two people can show behavioral responses on our tasks for same behavioral responses for very different reasons, and I think the modeling allows us to get a handle on those sorts of reasons, and also to relate those reasons to different mechanisms and processes in the brain. And I think that's just really very exciting. It sort of portends what we're calling a move towards computational psychiatry in the field. That might be something you've come across recently. There have been a number of papers published upon it, and I think our work sort of slots into that quite nicely. And the idea is, if we can understand the processes that are leading to people to have these symptoms and how they might be instantiated in the brain, we might be able to develop treatments on an individual level that target those processes that people are having more of a problem with. So rather than saying that all delusions are caused by hyper-engagement of dopamine or hyperdopamine release, we can think about what dopamine does in the brain, how it interacts with other neurotransmitters, and how it produces changes in our phenomenal experience of the world. And that, you know, we then might be able to interview people and test them on our different tasks and use the models of people's behavior and how they relate to neural activity to decide where in that sort of model someone might be having a problem. You know, whether it is a dopaminergic-driven psychosis or perhaps a dysfunction related to glutamate or any of the other neurotransmitters like acetylcholine could potentially be involved in these learning mechanisms. And in doing that, we might then be able to shuttle people towards particular treatments. So I think that's where the work's headed, and I think it's a really exciting prospect. We're not there yet. I think the initial work we've done has been a sort of proof of principle, and now with the support of IMRO and the Rising Star Award, we're starting to be able to put it into practice, and I think that's really exciting.
Definitely, definitely. And individualized treatments are kind of the holy grail, I believe, of translational research today. And so that's great that you have some leads there. We have a question coming in from a viewer named Chico Loco. The question is, cognitive impairment and negative symptoms, do they share the same pathophysiology? You talked a little bit about a tangential topic. You talked something related to that before, but do you want to address this question directly?
So are they related? Are they the same thing?
Yeah, do cognitive impairment and negative symptoms share the same pathophysiology?
Well, you know, when people sort of studied this statistically in the 1990s, they used a procedure called factor analysis, which is a way of kind of clumping our data together into kind of meaningful categories. And the factor analyses of people's experiences of schizophrenia really pointed towards three separate factors: cognitive deficits, positive symptoms, and negative symptoms. But I do see how all three of those things can relate to one another. So, for example, having positive symptoms that are very debilitating might lead one to be less socially engaged, and that might manifest itself as negative symptoms. And I think cognitive deficits might also relate very strongly to both positive and negative symptoms. So I don't think we have any data to say definitively that they're all related to a common pathophysiological mechanism, but I can see ways in which they interact with one another and exacerbate one another. And does that answer the question, you think?
I think that's a pretty good answer. If this viewer, Chico Loco, has any follow-up question, they can post it. But that sounds like you've answered it to the best of your ability. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Now, there's another question from a viewer named James Rossi. The question is, the stated adverse side effects of ertigabyne include neuropsychiatric events such as psychotic symptoms and hallucinations. How can it be given safely to treat anhedonia in someone who has a diagnosis of schizophrenia?
So I think that's a really important point. I think if you look at the side effects of many of the current antipsychotics, they also might engender psychosis and neuropsychiatric impairments. And you know, in our study, we're giving single doses as a sort of proof of principle investigation, and we're keeping a very close eye on the patients in our study to make sure that everything's being done safely and appropriately. I'm not proposing that ertigabyne is something that people should start taking immediately. We're really at a sort of very early phase of our investigations of the drug and its mechanisms. And James is quite right. That is a stated side effect. But at the doses that we're using in our study, that's not something that's happened in any of the previous work, nor in the work that we've been doing so far. And I do think it's a sort of curious observation that many of the antipsychotics can have side effects of exacerbating psychosis. And I think it points to the amazing non-linearity of the brain and the sort of complexities of what we're dealing with. But in this initial work, at least, we know that that's potentially a problem, and we're doing everything we can to sort of mitigate it.
Okay, thank you for answering that question too, Phil. Another question from James Rossi. What dosage of ertigabyne do you plan on using in your clinical trials, I guess you mean specifically, to lessen its potentially adverse side effects?
So I believe we're using a dose of 200 milligrams, and I think the doses at which the adverse side effects were observed were much, much higher.
Okay, great. Thanks for filling in that information too. So I had a couple of other questions before we close, and people can still ask questions while I ask you these. So you're talking about computational analysis and the using in a related part of your research, understanding that you trace the frequency of use of words of people with schizophrenia in their writing as a means to diagnose possibly schizophrenia or the prodromal phase of schizophrenia perhaps at some point. Yeah. And you found so far that people who live with schizophrenia and live in institutions have a much higher frequency of use of words that relate to their monotonous institutional life. What does this point out about the need for developing new treatments like you're doing that can enable people to function independently outside of an institution and hopefully get back to a fulfilling and productive life?
I think it's a really, really important point. In the initial work that we did on this topic, I took some transcribed interviews from one particular patient and tracked their word use when they were floridly psychotic, when they first came in for treatment, and then as the treatment proceeded and their psychosis subsided. And I think one of the things that stuck out for us was that they talked a lot less about psychosis-related topics as the psychosis got better, but that then left a sort of a slightly upsetting observation that people became, they spoke a lot more about, well, this particular patient spoke a lot more about when they were having a cigarette break, when their medications were going to be administered, what medications they were taking. And so you point out that being in an institution for a long time can lead you to have a more rigid approach to your life. And that's even in the absence of disturbing psychotic symptoms. So I think that particular observation was really profound. In more recent work that we're just submitting for publication, we've actually analyzed people's blogs that have been published online, people who self-identify as having schizophrenia, and compared them to people with other illnesses, and also with other mental illnesses and with other physical illnesses, and then also with groups of people who express strong beliefs, people who believe in conspiracy theories, for example, people who have Morgellons syndrome, a group of individuals who actually believe their bodies are infested with parasites, but they don't recognize that as a psychotic illness, and they've been quite successful in lobbying the CDC to investigate these ideas. And so we compared those groups. We thought initially that people with psychosis, their language use would cluster together with the people who had strong beliefs, like the conspiracy theorists, for example, and also like these folks with Morgellons syndrome. Actually, what we found was that the folks with schizophrenia clustered together with people with other physical illnesses, like spinal cord injury, for example, and other mental illnesses like Asperger's syndrome, which is a sort of higher functioning version of autism. And when we looked closely at what people were writing about, they were really talking about social themes in all of those groups, how their illness really impacted on their life and their ability to interact with other people, and not so much about their delusions and not so much about their sort of psychotic experiences. And I think that's really profound. When people turn up in the hospital for treatment, that's the thing that we're confronted with, and so we assume that's the thing that's most problematic. And actually, as we dig deeper, we're seeing things that are really bothering people that perhaps we're not as attuned to listening to as clinicians and researchers. And one of the things I'm really hopeful that we can do is to listen a little bit better, to take this empirical work and have it guide us towards, picking up on the signals that people are putting out there to us that perhaps, given the constraints of our current nosology and the way our field works, we're less equipped to hear. And I think, again, I keep saying this, but a really important thing about the work that I've been able to do because of the Rising Star Award is to really appreciate these issues and to kind of tackle them head on in a way that I might not have been able to do via more traditional funding mechanisms.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Phil, for explaining all that. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree that you need to listen if you're a clinician to somebody who lives with a mental illness and understand what they're going through in order to treat them, you know, in the most appropriate way for them, not just, you know, as a quote patient or a case, or, you know, give them just a pill. Although medication is an important part of treatment and you're developing better ones. So that's a great insight too. Phil, thank you so much for being with us on Brainwaves today. To the audience, when after I stop this broadcast, if you would like to watch the recording on imro.org/brainwaves, I will post it there, and there'll be a little call out to visit that site on this recording on Google after the recording is done. And then you can go to the IMRO website, imhro.org/brain-waves, and ask questions from today through Friday, February 27th. Phil will answer questions there on that site until then. So Phil, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Definitely. And best of luck in your work, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.